Hello and welcome to our interview today with Sarah Rozenthuler. We're going to be talking about navigating challenging conversations for success, which is based on her wonderful new book, Now We're Talking. So Sarah, lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you too, Fiona. Delighted to be here.
And today we're going to have some conversations based loosely around education and schooling and what it's involved in families and employees moving to another location. And I think many people will appreciate that it's quite a challenging time for all concerned. So let's go over to you first, Sarah. Tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to write this wonderful new book.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm a business psychologist by background. I'm particularly interested in communication, whether it's one on one or in group or team settings. And in the 20 plus years I've been doing work as a consultant psychologist, I've seen a lot of people avoiding having difficult conversations, and the research tells us it's about 70% of leaders and managers say they don't like having those difficult conversations. And the other pattern I see is attempting to have those conversations, but botching it and making a real mess of it. So I wanted to write this book to help managers and leaders develop the confidence and the competence and the courage to have challenging conversations.
Brilliant. So let's start with the first scenario. So imagining an international move. So let's take the first one. A concerned partner or spouse, probably with children, facing an international move and having to change their school and their home and their partner changing jobs. So perhaps you could just talk us through how the techniques and processes described in your book can help in that sort of situation.
Yes, well, I think it's important to start by acknowledging the emotions that are present for people and how high stakes this might be as well. It's a major decision and it's going to affect not only people's careers but family life and that sense of stability as well. So, very understandable that emotions could be running high, and also that each partner might be feeling quite differently about the potential opportunity here. So you might have one partner feeling excited, and you might have another partner feeling really quite concerned about this potential change or perhaps even disruption. So, an important starting point would be to just slow down and take the time to acknowledge how people are feeling so that the partners can really listen to one another and feel heard. That would be a very good starting point.
So, Sarah, what about the reluctant employee? Let's think about, say, the lead parent, who's the employee, who needs to negotiate with their employer whether or not they will take up this international assignment. And at first instance, they're sort of reluctant.
Yes, and again, I'm just going to acknowledge this is a potentially really big change here and decision. So I think it's really important to prepare for this conversation. And that old saying, to fail to prepare is to prepare to fail, I think really applies to a tricky conversation, potentially tricky conversation like this. So I think it's very good before you talk to your employer to just get clear on what your reasons would be if you are going to say actually you want to stay, what your reasons are for staying. And of course, you might also be thinking through the possibility of moving as well. I think once you're in the conversation with your employer, it's really good to come from a place of appreciation and openness. So, whichever way you're deciding you want to proceed, I think it's good to acknowledge and appreciate the opportunities you've been having, including this potential opportunity for growth. If you don't want to go for it, then I think it's important to give clear reasons why, and to give reasons for perhaps why your contribution you think will be stronger if you stay where you are at the moment. And then you might also be speaking about the impact on your family as well. And just briefly, in terms of being open minded as well, you might be thinking through, as part of your preparation, what other possibilities are here, whether that's around hybrid working or whether you could stay in your existing location, but you would be open to visiting the international office um, at an agreed rhythm. So just transmitting that you're open minded could also go down really well with your employer.
Yes, and of course, in all these conversations, it's important not to make assumptions on either side.
Absolutely, yes.
So there may be opportunities, and equally, there may be solutions to be found if you have a really good open conversation with your employer.
Yes, yes,
So then the third scenario possibly is the overlooked employee. And so for the sake of this argument, let's think this is a frustrated employee, possibly a female potential assignee, who is really frustrated to find that a male colleague has been offered an exciting international assignment that may also contain promotion possibilities, better pay, etc. So what does she do? Does she speak out, or does she feel she's risks being sidelined? And again, assumptions. Is she making assumptions? Is the company making assumptions? So that's a good one to explore if you could give us some ideas.
yes. And I think you're absolutely right, Fiona, to underline the need to reflect on the assumptions in play here, both the employer and on the employee's part as well, because the employee might assume that they're being overlooked because of their gender or because of unconscious bias. And the employer actually just might not fully understand what the aspirations are, or what the readiness is of that employee for an international role. And so, going into that conversation, I think it's very good to be prepared to share what your aspirations are. So, you might be asking yourself specifically, what career goals do I have, and how might an international assignment or a promotion align with that? It's an opportunity to reflect on your strengths and what you bring to the organisation as well. I think it's really important with this conversation and with other challenging conversations to think about how you would initiate the conversation. What would your opening line be, for example, with your manager here? And I think if you can bring a combination of curiosity and assertiveness, it will really strengthen you. So you might say something like, I've noticed the recent assignment opportunity abroad. I'd like to discuss my own interest in international roles. I feel that it does align with my career goals, and I'd love to explore what steps I can take to be considered for future opportunities. So you're coming out with some real confidence, but also an inquiring mind about how you could get ready for a future opportunity.
And planning ahead, as you say, can open up all sorts of things you may not have thought about before, and what your real
Yes,
purpose is, which is another hot topic. So that
yes,
takes us nicely into the really difficult questions that people find, like asking for a pay rise or wanting that promotion. So if we step it up a bit, how does your book cover the processes involved in preparing yourself?
Yeah, well, again, a little bit of preparation here can go a long way before having a conversation where, for example, you want to ask for a pay rise. And I think it would be good to go in with some clear evidence that will strengthen your request and underline your value to your organisation. So again, you might be reflecting on your achievements and recent contributions that you've made to the company. You might do some market research and look at in your industry what peers of you are being paid. You might go to websites like Glassdoor or PayScale and look at average salaries for your role, your industry, and your location. And you might also reflect on how you've grown in your role and how your skills and knowledge are now ready for a greater level of responsibility, which would justify the increase in pay. I also think that there's something about timing here as well. I often say with challenging conversations, pick your moment. And so there might be a natural point in the year cycle, for example, when this would be a conversation to lean into having. That might be, for example, when you're having a performance review with your manager, or maybe your company's been doing well, performing well, and there's been some growth, and your experience is sort of congruent, sorry, your request is congruent with that and more likely to be received positively as well. So, timing, really important for this conversation.
Brilliant. So you think we've covered pay rises and promotions. Are there any other really tricky ones that are common, do you think, for employees?
Oh gosh, well, it's always challenging to give, let's call it constructive feedback. Sometimes we make a distinction between motivation feedback and then developmental feedback. And I know many managers and leaders who shy away from giving the tricky feedback. And yet, I often think if people don't get feedback, then it's very likely the blind spot is going to remain. So, how could you expect anybody to change their behaviour if you're not responsible for giving that feedback? Of course, what you're not responsible for is the other person's response and reaction to the feedback. And this is, I think, again, what makes people shy away from challenging conversations, because we don't know what we're going to be met with, whether it's somebody getting very upset or somebody getting angry. So, another part of preparing for challenging conversations is to be ready for different responses from the other person. And I often think that principle of hope for the best and prepare for the worst is a good principle to follow. So think through the best case scenario, but think through the worst case. And if the conversation were to or get really tricky, what you would say at that point. And it might be, let's just take a pause and we can come back to this conversation, whether that's in 10 minutes' time or another day. So that your fear of the other person's response doesn't stop you from leaning in.
Great, thank you. So that again leads us into our next scenario, which is really for leaders. And as this is primarily about the education sector, leaders of schools and education establishments, these are very, very big employers, often overseas with lots of employees and possibly sister schools, etc. So there's a lot going on. They're responsible for a community, not only the academic, but their own staff, and also the children and parents as well as the to a certain extent in the local community. So in these uncertain times, can we just talk a bit about handling a crisis? And obviously, the leaders, there'll be several leaders in the school, but in those sorts of contexts, how do you prepare to handle a crisis? The other scenario we talked about was unstable geopolitical climate.
Yes. So I think when there's a crisis, or for example, if there's a real lack of trust that's opened up in your organisation, in your school, I think it's really important that you, as the leader, acknowledge and own that issue. So it's really important to just be very clear that we've got a crisis on our hands here, a very difficult situation. And I think that acknowledgement in very clear language for people communicates a sense of transparency and accountability, and it signals to people that you're aware of the and that you're ready to address it. And that, I think, is a very strong starting point. You might then, as a leader, really create a safe space for having some honest and authentic dialogue. You might have a series of one to one conversations with people involved, so you're getting to know what the real concerns and issues are. You might then bring people together so people have an opportunity to voice their concerns, and if you can set an atmosphere where people don't feel blamed in any way, they'll feel able to speak out with fear of repercussions. And when you bring people together, you could also get people to talk in smaller groups about what's going on here, what the situation is, with the shared aim of trying to understand the situation and what the different perspectives are. You're not trying to assign fault in any way, but you're just gathering feedback and information about what's happened here. And the other thing I'm just going to quickly add is the importance in this scenario, and indeed all the scenarios, of listening actively without judgment. So you're not listening to fix anything, certainly not to begin with. You're not listening to persuade, you are listening without judgment to understand how it is that this crisis situation has arisen, and also listening for other people's perspectives and ideas that might help you navigate your way through the situation.
And a lot of our listeners are in possibly unstable geopolitical areas. So, say there is some sort of natural disaster or some sort of problem in the local environment. How do leaders manage to manage and align the different sort of stakeholder groups? So in a school, as we said before, it's obviously the pupils, the staff, the employees, but also the wider community of the parents as well, and also the spreading out into the local community. So if something really bad happens, how does a leader take control of as much as they can and impart information?
I mean, this is obviously a very challenging scenario, and it's going to be calling on you as a leader to be, sometimes we talk in leadership development work of being that non anxious presence in the room, which is clearly a big ask in a situation like this. And to the extent you are able to acknowledge the situation calmly and honestly yourself, and again using straightforward language, underlying what the priorities here are, that everybody is safe, that you want to do some proactive planning, for example, not using any alarming language, then your sense of calm is really going to help other people to stay calm as well, because as the leader, you set the tone, and the atmosphere here will be in large part about where you're coming from. And you might be reminding your community that you want to prepare for an eventuality or a certain very difficult situation arising. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen, but you want to be responsible and take precautions.
Brilliant, thank you. And then taking it to a more personal level, obviously schools have lots of interaction with employees and also with parents. So what about if there is a sort of conflict situation between staff members and or parents dissatisfied? Some just sort of lighter touch approaches.
Yes. So again, I think it would be wise to have some one-to-ones initially with the concerned parties so that you can really understand what's going on here, what people's concerns are. You might be needing to gather facts as well about what's happened. So I think it's good to start with one-to-ones. You then are probably going to need to bring people together to discuss what's happened. And again, it's going to be really, you can create an environment in the right place. You might want to be thoughtful about the setting for this conversation where people can feel safe to open up and talk. Sometimes ground rules really help here. So, ground rules around being open and honest and authentic, listening as fully as you can. You might also be really clear that there's going to be a pattern where one person speaks and the other person listens. Initially, they will have their turn to speak, and then you swap over. You might ask the different parties to summarise what they've heard to check their understanding, and you might be supporting that as well, so that overall you're building a shared understanding about what's happened and finding a way through together.
Thank you very much. And then just on a final note, obviously schools can and are very happy, joyful places full of energy and excitement. So they have wonderful news of exam results or celebrating an anniversary or International Day in international schools. So there is something, isn't there, about leaders sharing the good news and celebrating with everyone. So we quite often, there's so much planning behind these things, people forget about the celebrating. So do you have some tips for that, celebrating success?
Oh, I'm so pleased you brought it in as well, because it's a very there's a principle in psychology: what you focus on expands. So it's very good, as you say, to celebrate successes and good news stories and achievements. And you might even just, in a very light touch way, in a staff meeting, ask people what's been a recent proud moment for you, or you might invite each person to talk about what's the most exciting thing you're working on. So you've got some positivity injected into the conversation, and of course, you might then go on and have an award ceremony and you can also inject positivity in a very day-to-day way as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Sarah. We are very keen for people to take a look at your book. Now we're talking, and there are lots of scenarios for individuals, for employers and employees, and also the models that people can follow to practice. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Fiona.
And you can find out more about Sarah and her background in the biographical details. And this webinar recording interview has been part of our series for Relocate Global and Think Global People. I'm Fiona Murchie, the managing editor. Do get in touch with Sarah Rozenthuler and buy her wonderful books. And you can keep in touch with all things regarding education and schooling and managing international teams and global mobility by tuning in to our resources at relocateglobal.com and thinkglobalpeople.com. Thank you very much.